Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Chinese Studies CCS Scholars Forum. It's a great pleasure to welcome everyone here. My name is Michael Berry. I'm a professor of Asian languages and cultures, and I'm the director of the Center for Chinese Studies. This is part of a speaker series that we launched last year, and this is the second incarnation of it. Our first CCS Scholars Forum featured a variety of scholars from different fields across the UCLA campus. And it's a somewhat idiosyncratic forum in that normally when you attend academic events, you get a couple anthropologists together on a panel or a couple literary scholars together, people from the same field, often from a very close discipline. What makes this forum somewhat unique is that we intentionally try to mix up the pool of people that we're bringing together. And the reason for that is we really want to build bridges across the UCLA campus and beyond for creating a forum whereby scholars working on divergent aspects of contemporary and pre-modern and modern Chinese studies from a variety of backgrounds, variety of fields and subfields can come together and share their interests in kind of succinct, short, somewhat accessible talks whereby we can hopefully build a stronger community with more collaboration amongst our scholarly community. And so that's the impetus behind this. And so for today's forum, I'm very happy that we have, again, three scholars from very different areas, to very different fields. They are going to be Professor Sherry Wu from the Anderson School of Management, Hu Liangyu, or Liangyu Hu, who is a visiting scholar in Chinese language and literature from Peking University, who is here at UCLA this year. And finally, Huijun Mai, who is a brand new faculty. Actually, I think her appointment begins in exactly 1 month in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures. And I'll be introducing each of our speakers just before they begin. And the format will be each speaker will have approximately 15 to 20 minutes to give a succinct introduction either to their research or to a current research project that they're working on. And again, we want these to be accessible so that we can all kind of build bridges, we can find connections amongst one another. And then at the end, we'll open it up for your questions and hopefully have a exciting conversation to follow. For the conversation, we'll ask you to use your raised hand function, and then we'll unmute you so you can ask your questions. But without further ado, I'm going to move on to our first speaker. But before I even introduce our speaker, I think I really have to say something about what's happening in the world out there, because as we all know, we're here in some of us are here in Los Angeles, and not just in Los Angeles, but throughout the country. It's been a very tumultuous time. And I know even I, as the organizer, ethically ask myself if it's even the right time to continue on with an event like this, given the very grave tensions that are playing out everywhere in this country. And I do at the very least want to say that on behalf of the Center of Chinese Studies, that we do care about what's happening. We endorse Black Lives Matter. We hope that we can find a peaceful resolution to all of the conflicts and a way forward. And I think maybe, a small contribution is that we want to keep doing positive things to build communities. And I think a forum like this, although it's not directly tied to race relations and the topics at hand, I think it is about building bridges. It is about communication, mutual understanding. And in that spirit, I hope we can all move forward to create a more positive society than what we've been facing. And so I just wanted to begin with a few words about that. And I also encourage our speakers, if there's anything you want to say about what's happening, as a prelude to your talk, please. I think everybody has this on their minds right now. That said, let me move on to our first speaker, Professor Sherry Wu. She is an assistant professor in the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. Her research deals with group influence over long-lasting behavioral changes and decision processes under resource disparity and social inequalities. She received her PhD in psychology with a doctoral joint degree in social policy from the Woodrow Wilson School of Public and International Affairs at Princeton. And she also has a BA from the University of Virginia. She is interested in the psychology of culture and social influence. And in some of her prior work, she conducted field experiments with groups of Chinese factory workers. And so I'm going to hand it over to Professor Wu. And you have the floor.
Well, Can you all see my slides? Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Aiko, for inviting me. I'm Sherry Jue Wu, or Wu Jue from UCLA Anderson. It's a great pleasure to be here in these difficult times. Today, I'm going to present a series of work on voice that I started in graduate school, and it's pretty much work in progress thinking about the future directions. So I'd like you to gather your feedback along the way. So ideas about individuals' participation in their work groups, citizen groups, and religious groups has fascinated a wide range of scholars. For example, economists have been interested in the relationship between participation and economic development. Organizational scientists have been interested in whether participatory groups are better at their work. And political theorists have been interested in the democratic effects of participation in civic groups. So I'm interested in a broad category of participation within this range, inspired by early and ongoing work in psychology. So a general definition of participation is a process in which influence or decision power is shared between hierarchical superiors and their subordinates. But I'm not studying group decision-making here. So for the work I present, I would define participation as the extent to which influence is shared in groups. If I were to ask people, what are the effects of participation in groups? People may think, well, don't you already know that? The intuition is that it makes people feel more empowered and more motivated, as theory suggests that participation flattens group hierarchy, enable us to learn more information about our group members, and you also get to have your voice heard, which might be motivating by itself. Okay, so all these sound good and right. But part of my job today is to actually persuade you that we do not know as much as we like. The causal evidence is lacking. Empirically, research has been done in organizational behavior about team participation, or in cognitive psychology about the particular forms of participation when you're thinking about goals, or in social psychology about the structuring groups and how that's related to participation and productivity. So one way I would categorize these findings is that they are not all showing benefits of participation. There are lots of debates and conflicting findings. The other way I would categorize many of this work coming out of psychology is that it's often with non-natural groups that are formed for the purposes of experiments in the lab without any external forces taken into account. Or we survey natural groups in the field, but they don't have any causal inference. So in summary, the evidential base for the benefits of participation is largely lacking. So why do we still believe that we know the effects of participation, facing such weak evidential base? I argue that value-based endorsement of participation is perhaps one reason that the popularity of participatory strategies outreaches its evidential base. So participation is a value that rooted in Western political ideology. So the idea that participation is perhaps as old as the idea of Western democracy. So there's a long tradition of writing about this idea, starting from Rousseau and Carol Pateman, and many of our great political theorists have talked about it. It is very consistent with the ethos of Western participatory democracy. However, the intuition is not that obvious for the non-Western crowd. We may easily forget that participation is not universally valued. So in many cultures, endorsement of strict social hierarchies featuring minimal participation is prevalent in its philosophical and political writings. For example, in ancient China, Confucianism denotes that a basic set of moral values for women, called 3 obedience and 4 virtues, which emphasize absolute obedience for women to men. So even though these behavioral codes has been largely abandoned nowadays, they have shaped the East Asian cultures to the extent that harmony and obedience sometimes are prioritized over participation and dissent.
Sherry, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're only seeing your opening slide. For some reason, the sharing is not showing the full PowerPoint, so you might want to adjust your PowerPoint.
Oh, that's weird. It is moving on my end. Maybe I will quit and reshare it again.
Yeah, that might work. Now we're seeing what are the effects of participation groups on your slide. So maybe now it's synced up.
I see. So maybe I shouldn't make it full screen then.
Yeah, now your PPT is working.
Okay, okay, great.
Sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Sorry about that. Okay, so I just leave it as the PDF rather than full screen. So at this point, do we know the effects of participation? This is up for debate. You may think it's a beautiful thing, but the past literature is not finding it. There's conflicting findings and almost no field experimental evidence. And we need some really solid naturalistic tests to get us going. So this is where my work comes in. I would like to get this causal inference using natural groups in the field. I conduct 2 field experiments, one with 65 Chinese factory work groups, which will be the focus of this presentation, and a conceptual replication with 34 university staff groups. So both field experiments were preceded by prior field observations, including archival data analysis and ethnographic work. So first, I did experimenting in modern factory in China. This context is particularly interesting as you can think of it as a boundary case. So on one hand, participation may not work well because it's not as welcoming. On the other hand, it could work particularly well because Chinese factory workers are not typically offered the opportunity to participate, and thus a small dose might have a larger effect than in other contexts where participation is more common. So second, this context is particularly relevant as this is where the majority of our manufacturing is happening. And we were gonna do it in a workplace, in a factory, measuring individual accomplishment within groups. This is the place to be. So most workers in this factory are young women. They come a long way from the rural area of China to work in the factory in the city. They're highly motivated by the relatively decent wages that can help them pull themselves up into the lower middle class. Many of them actually constantly send their money home to their families. So the workers are paid by the piece rate, which means the more they produce, the more they earn. So their gross salary before taxation and the fees are actually a perfect indicator of worker productivity. So workers in the sewing departments work in groups, but their work is relatively individual. So working together as a group can help, but it's really mostly dependent on themselves. So once the worker is hired by the factory and assigned to a particular group, she or he rarely rotates. So these were intact, natural existing groups. So with this project, I want to address 2 main questions. For one, what is the effect of participatory meetings on worker productivity? I'll say more about what is a participatory meeting, but this is a classic paradigm in social psychology. The general idea is what if we make these workers' work lives more participatory in a small way on a regular basis? So if there were an effect, why would the participatory group structure motivate behavioral change? Specifically, building upon the theoretical intuition, I predict that participatory meeting may change behavior either because people learn more information from each other, or they may set different type of goals, or most importantly, they get to say their voice, which is the motivating factor by itself. For 2, I want to know, do groups that encourage participation influence broader attitudes toward the self and the society, including self-empowerment and attitudes toward broader societal authority and justice? So I conducted the first experiment in a large multinational textile factory in the city of Suzhou, east coastal area of China. I recruited all 65 work groups in the factory's sewing department and randomly assigned the groups into the treatment and control condition. So half the groups were assigned the treatment condition and the other half groups were assigned to the control condition. These were all random assignment. So before we came into the factory, each of these groups have existing 20-minute morning meeting every day. And in the control condition, these were just their status quo meeting, which typically looked like the supervisor lecturing the workers on their work strategies, how well they were doing, and setting individual goal for each worker. Once per week for 6 weeks, we send the research assistants to observe and take notes to rule out the novelty effect so that everybody knows that they are under study. For the treatment condition, we changed the structure of their regular morning meeting once per week for 6 weeks. So specifically, a research assistant facilitated discussion, and we invite the workers to discuss on their work problems, work strategies. And at the end of the meeting, each worker set an individual goal for themselves rather than by the supervisors. This also happened 20 minutes once per week for 6 weeks. So these charts compare the treatment and placebo meetings. So we can see that informational structure is largely similar. Both is centered around production and work strategies and have a goal-setting element in the end. But in the treatment participatory meeting condition, information comes from the workers, while in the control status quo meeting condition, it all comes from the supervisors. So the experiment is carried out in the 6-week experimental period, followed by 2 survey waves conducted 1 week and 4 weeks after the end of the intervention. So before, during, and after the experiment, we have continuous data collection for our behavioral outcomes. The gross salary, basically how much money each worker get into their pocket by the end of the day. So during the 6-week experimental period, our research assistant recorded the behavioral metrics for the proposed mechanisms: information, goal, or voice. And during the 2 survey waves, we measured the individual empowerment and the group empowerment, the cluster of attitudes that indicate how people think about themselves and those around them. So this is basically the time series production trend for our workers. So here is the control group's productivity. So each blue dot in the background indicate one group's total productivity in every single day before, during, and after intervention. And we can see there's a lot of fluctuation in their production, which is actually consistent with the Chinese factory seasonal production trend. So people's productivity tend to rise post-Chinese Lunar New Year when the factory's demand increase, and it tend to plateau and decrease gradually in the second half of the year. And I have data going back every year, and actually we always observe the same seasonal production pattern. So what do we see when we add on the treatment workers' productivity curve? The red line. So we can see that before the start of the treatment, the red and blue is largely chasing each other. There's no significant difference. But right after the start of the intervention, we started to see these white spaces, meaning that the treatment groups are being significantly more productive than the control groups. And the difference sustained for quite a while and then gradually attenuated. So another way to visualize these changes is using the probability density function. So one can see at the baseline period, the blue and green distribution are largely overlapping. There's no significant difference. And 6 weeks during and also 6 weeks after the end of the intervention, we see the red distribution shifted to the right, meaning the treatment workers' productivity are much higher than the control workers' productivity. This holds even when these meetings were no longer taking place. So in terms of the effect size, the treatment worker, each individual is actually earning 500 RMB, 500 yuan more than the control workers, about 10% more in terms of their average gross salary compared to the control. So we see there's a significant behavioral difference. So what is the active ingredient? What is the channel through which that participatory meeting is bringing these productivity change? So as said, we tested several rivalry hypotheses. Is it because people get different information? Or is it people set different goals? Or is it because their attitudes change? Or is it because they now have the channel of having their voice heard in this regular way and in this platform? So I have all the regression table ready, but for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize that we actually did not find any evidence that information goal setting is the major channel for behavioral change. However, we find quite consistent evidence that voice measured in multiple ways is correlated with productivity change. Specifically, we found that the amount of time workers spending talking on either production or on non-production was actually significantly correlated with their productivity. And the amount of time their supervisor encouraged the workers was significantly correlated. And interestingly, the amount of time their supervisor interrupting the workers or scolding the workers in discussion was netly predictive of productivity change. And finally, another piece of evidence is that, if you remember in the curve, that the productivity spike really early on in the intervention at week 1. So before they were doing anything informational or goal-based, because the week 1 session was mostly getting to know each other and warming up. So this indicates there's something about the general structure of these meetings rather than informational goal content that is leading to the change. So what happens to people's workplace attitudes? So here, the x-axis is the activity constructs, and the y-axis is the difference between the treatment and control groups. So basically, this chart indicates that the treatment workers are reporting higher job satisfaction, sense of control, and the attitudes related to their work groups than the control people, except that there's no difference in worker well-being between the treatment and control. And when we remeasure the same attitudes 4 weeks after the end of the intervention, I basically found the same trend. So what I find really remarkable about this is that these workers were no longer doing these participatory meetings anymore. But nevertheless, this has an enduring impact on how they feel about their work and the way they worked. So this lasted even when they were no longer doing these meetings. So we see that voice is an active ingredient for the local participatory, for the local change in behavior and attitudes. So the next question I have is, does being asked for your voice in your group translate into wanting to have more voice in the broader society? So does local change spill over to how you think about the larger society? So the intuition is workplace inviting more worker participation can empower the workers, decreasing blind trust in authority and justice, and motivating political participation. So the idea is that basically participating in groups make you a better citizen, more empowered, and maybe more skeptical of authority and more willing to challenge authority. So we use the established scale from psychology to measure people's generalized attitudes toward authority and belief in the justice nature of the world. And I also included measures on people's participation behavior outside of work in their familial and social life. And these attitudes were all measured in survey wave 2, 4 weeks after the end of the intervention. So this is a summary of what we have found. So we found that the treatment worker actually reported significantly lower authoritarian attitudes and significantly lower belief in the justice nature of the world. There's about 1 standard deviation on the survey measurement scale, and perhaps more interesting that it carried over 4 weeks after the end of the intervention. And I also find that the treatment workers' self-reported engagement with politics and family life also changed, which is of interest to a broader story change. So these findings, I think, should be interpreted within the context of the experiment. So many of these factory workers experience familial and social isolation as migrant workers. And as young women, they're also relatively disempowered, even in decision about their own children. They live back home in the rural areas with their family. So the greater critique of authority and lower belief in the justice nature of the world, in a company with increasing assertion of the self, would suggest a global shift that I cautiously labeled empowerment. Of course, future work will need to verify these self-reported claims by measuring concrete behavior, perhaps with standardized behavioral games, or with difficulty but higher payoff in the context of these workers' own lives in rural China, and also in the city. So to conclude, I find clear causal evidence that participation groups shifted workers' behavior and attitudes, and it is voice rather than informational goals that is driving the behavioral change. And we also found that local participatory group structure actually can change broader attitudes towards societal authority and justice, the sort of construct that has long theorized to be personality-based construct in social psychology. And on the application side, the intervention costs little or nothing because it may impose minimal burden on factory workers and managers, as we are utilizing some existing structure that they already have. So it has some potential for scaling up in the future. So outside of this line of work on group, I also do judgment decision-making and specifically people's social inequality and hierarchy within the society. I'm also a big fan of research methodology. So I'd like to thank you for listening, and also thank my PhD advisor, Betsy Levy-Palak, and Alder Shafir, and also for the grants I received for this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wu. We really appreciate you sharing your research. And it's my pleasure to now introduce our second speaker. Our second speaker is Liangyu Hu, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Chinese Language and Literature at Peking University. He is one of the students of Dai Jinhua, one of the kind of towering figures in the area of modern Chinese cultural studies. And currently he's a visiting graduate student researcher here at UCLA. His interests include cultural studies, film studies, and third worldism. And today he's going to be talking about his current doctoral dissertation project, which is The Third World and the World Imagination of Chinese in the Socialist Era, 1956 to 1976. So with that, please welcome Hu Liangyu.
Thank you, Professor Berry. Can you see my screen, my keynote?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you, Professor Berry, for inviting me to this special event. It's been a while since last time I just be with so many people. I mean, physically though, but it's still very exciting, especially in the nick of this crazy time, I guess. Today I'm going to briefly introduce my ongoing PhD dissertation. The project is aimed to examine in socialist era how Chinese people think, imagine, and write about the third world countries. So this questioning of this study originates from a certain time, like 5 or 6 years ago. A cultural phenomenon just became quite visible in Chinese big screens, like yeah, and you notice that there were narratives about the non-Western or third world countries appears intensively on Chinese big screen popular cultures. Most of them blockbuster, like I listed here, they were quite familiar for most of the people, I guess, because they were talked quite a lot, and they performed quite well in box offices.
Liangyu, sorry to interrupt. Your PowerPoint disappeared. We only see you. So I think you can share your screen again.
Okay. Maybe I shared the wrong desktops. Did it work again?
Yes, it's back now.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. And well, if you look at this stories, it's mostly about some crisis, political or military crisis suddenly erupted, like what we are witnessing now, usually in a place outside of China, the homeland, and the Chinese somewhere nowhere in Middle East, African country somewhere. And Chinese soldier got to step in to calm down the situation and save the Chinese people, sometimes local peoples, out of the crisis. Some of them are a little bit controversial, given the way how we express Chinese people and the other countries' peoples. Taking Wolf Warrior 2 as an example, I think the frequent criticism is leveled at, for example, the film's success is largely due to its translation of some of the worst elements of Hollywood formula. People say the Long Feng, the people Wu Jin played, is called Chinese Rambo or something. And the protagonist's psychotic behavior has been noted as an example of toxic masculinity, and he used uncontrolled violences. And also, people sense a bit of nationalism and sometimes chauvinist sentiments in this film. I think the African appear as a chaotic, violent, with local women and children in need of protection from the foreign forces. And it's interesting that the Chinese soldiers appears to be the one who taken the classic Orientalist white man's burden, by quoting Chris Berry's critics. But for me, there is another question worth asking. That's why is the African, or we say the third world country, appears as a chaotic and violent, but also anonymous background of this story, but remain anonymous. some use some fake names, and it's something like Wakanda or something, pretty much the same. But I think apart from the diplomatic and censorship consideration, it also reflects the political unconsciousness. In Lacani Express, the African or the third world country must be imagined and be represented as an absent present in contemporary China. In contemporary China, but this film are no doubt a type of the geographic distribution for the cultural imaginations in response to the need to come up with new narratives that respond to China's new global rule in the changing world system. It also makes me think that if this certain type of cultural practices is that responds China's new global rule, consistency of social reality for contemporary global China. So what kind of the third world writing once in response to the China earlier, like the socialist era China? When it comes to these questions, you realize that this retrospective exam is necessary and needed to be put in a socialist era, pre-globalization, late capitalism period. You also notice that the absence of the third world country in China's popular culture and big screen post-socialist, it's for a rather long time, I think since 1980s or something like that. So I try to trace back the notion of the third world in China. We can see there were lots of differences, terms, and it is also changing. And I got to say, in the context of the Chinese socialism, the official three-world theory was mentioned and named quite late, in 1974, when Mao Zedong had a meeting with some African countries' leaders. But there was some definition, there were some terms like intermediate zone mentioned in 1946, referring to some vast land regions between United States and USSR, and also marked by the Bandung conferences. China promoted the non-allied movement, and in 1964, Mao Zedong raised a concept. He actually added another intermediate zone. It became two intermediate zones. One of them is the developing country, third world country. Another one became Japan and Western European countries. And it also reflects the change of Chinese foreign policy, diplomatic policy, from the leaning on one side to USSR, and with the split of China, Soviet Union, and it goes to non-allied movements, and it goes to in 1960 with the radicalization, the revolutionization, the diplomacy became anti-American imperialism, at the same time anti-Soviet revisionism. So in 1974, as I mentioned earlier, that Mao officially bring up the three-world theory. He also emphasized some standard to categorize the three words. One of them is the development standard, as well as nuclear power and the population, etc. He also mentioned that China is a part of the third world, no doubt. But during the socialist era, I think the third world has another name, which is named Asian Afro-Latin American, in Chinese, Yafeila. It's formulated around the 1960s after the Cuban Revolution. Before that, it was always Asian and African. And after Cuban set up the socialist regime, and they put Latin American in, so this term, it became officially became Latin, Asian Afro-Latin American. And it's just officially became the term represents the third world. This is also why I choose 1956 to 1976 as a period of my research, is that it's marked by the Bandung Conference and the end of the Cultural Revolution. It also contained what Friedrich Jameson wants to said, the long 60s, that's the beginning marked by the Cuban Revolution and ended by the coup d'etat happened in Chile in 1973. It's longer than that. It's prolonged long 68 minutes. But there were some Chinese characteristics about third world and the three world theory. We can notice that the three world refers to Asian, Afro-Latin, Yafilan, but the Mao's three world theory is actually a retrospective conclusion or constructions over the 2 decades political, diplomatic, and as well as cultural experiences, which construct those countries as a whole geopolitical entity, which is also including China. But it's different from what we normally understand the three world theory. That's China didn't put American as the first country, US as the second country, but put these 2 superpowers as the very first country. So this logic is based upon the structure of the power rather than the division of the ideology. It also a pragmatic strategy, because when you face 2 superpowers at the same time, you're facing American and USSR, you got to find some friends actually. You have to use some rhetorical as well as some diplomatic strategy. So it's also a consideration for national security reasons. But it also point out that there is a alternative space. The highlighting there is an alternative space out of the bipolar ideology system became a alternative choice in that Cold War system. I think that is exactly the significance of the third world means today. It also calling the higher, this whole process is closely embedded in the global 60, what we usually say today. It led to a world spread of Maoism. Meanwhile, it offers a non-Western view in the process of the formulation of the Chinese nationalism and national building. Therefore, it calls for something higher, imaginative political identity beyond the Chinese boundary. Through massive, through popular culture's reproductions, the third world also became more or less the structural feeling, if I use the Raymond Williams term, that for a whole 1 or 2 generations, but it is unexamined for a very long period. So I think that's how this awareness of the question begins. Next, I would like to share a case of Vietnam man, his story and his story in China and somewhere else in the world back to the 60s. His name is Wen Van Troy. He was a electrician, a son of fisherman living in Saigon, and he became the Viet Cong member since the 1960s. And he was assigned to a mission that assassinates United States Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara in May 1964, but he was unfortunately captured and publicly executed in October 1964. After his death, the North, the Vietnam Cong just glorified him as a martyr, and he became a anti-American symbol and borrowed. His story was told in many countries around the world, and in third world country as well as in first world country. After several months, his widow published his memoir called The Way He Lived, and this book was translated into various languages, including Italian, English, Spanish, and of course Chinese. And this CD record is published by a Chilean folk band called Gila Bayun, and this family is involved quite deeply in the process of Salvador Allende's political campaign. He supported the left-wing leaders, and also this band played a very important role in the Chile new folk song movement. Also, this choice story was told by Abi Hoffman in his Steal This Book and Countercultural Movement. And on the right picture on the right side, it is Jane Fonda named his son the Troy's name is Troy Gravity. Oh, sorry, it's a misspell. It's also fascinating that the Troy story became a rather big cultural event in China. If we could look back to the 1964 to 1965, we can see the Chinese domestic and the foreign affair policy moved to a direction of the radicalization and the revolutionization, and most notably the support of Vietnam. In May 1965, the government officially announced the assist in Vietnam to resist U.S. Policy, Wu and Hu Liangyu. And in the art front, it also confirmed this same policy that's supporting the Vietnam people to struggle against the United States. Also, the art policy requires the writers and the people to portray the heroic figures, and also going to the mass to serve the people, the most of the people as possible as they can. And like I said, the memorial Live Like Him was published. There were millions of copies published in China. And the story was soon adapted into various forms of opera and drama, which is quite interesting. And from the Huajun, the Chinese modern drama, to the Pingju, the Ping opera, and to some very local, the provincial form of the drama, like Longjiangju, Chuanju, Heilongjiang, etc., etc. Different, all kinds of the local drama. We can also see his story was also written and drawn in serial picture comic books. There was they put some Chinese factors and also Chinese characteristics in there. For example, they emphasize on the struggle of the classes and some dramatic conflicts, and also to highlight the heroic figure of Troy and the consciousness of the classes, etc., etc. It is worth mentioning that during the process, I mean, the story of Troy from a foreigner story to a Chinese story, and to the Chinese local story. I think the Central Art Institute American Apparatus have placed a great emphasis on the principle of socialist realism, demanding a reproduction of the characters and the scenery on stage as realistic as possible. So we often see those guidelines and instructions, like the picture shows, to teach the local theater groups to how to accurately reproduce and represent the Vietnamese, the clothes, the costume, etc., but also translate it to a Chinese story to some extent. At the same time, due to this specific mass cultural mechanism of the socialist period, the theater attendance tends to be surprisingly high. Here is a quote from the Xiju Bao, the theater papers. Also mentioned how many people, lots of people seeing this play, but also ask for the copy of scripts, etc. A little bit exaggerated though, but I think more or less reflect the people, they ask them about this play. Just wrap it up very quickly that there were many cases. I pick up one of these, probably most interesting one, because have the worldwide influence. We see that Vietnam as a third world country, for China, it represents the threat of the imperialism, we can see. And also, I think more importantly is that as a Chinese official ideology, and Marxism, Leninism, Maoism ideology, it requires a continued revolution, 继续革命. But for China as some country who finished this process of the revolution, it is a tension between 继续革命 and your peace status quo in China. So the third world of Vietnam became somewhere they can place their revolution imaginations toward to somewhere, some places, and became some kind of mediation of the tension between ideologies inside China. In a broader sense, I think the third world is also stretch out the edge of the China. In the discussion of the modern Chinese nationalism formulation, the Taiwanese scholar Wu and Hu once gave us a hint that an identity is often not defined, it's not defined by its interior, but also by its margin. Like you draw a circle on the paper, you just start from the margin. So in a broad sense, the third word, identifying the range of Chinese nationalism and why it became its edge to some extent. So in the third word became both internal and external for China. In cultural practices, we see that China's socialist cultural apparatus mechanism takes the ethnicity from the third world and reproduce them via revolutionary discourses and narratives translated to Chinese story, and then reproduce the identity or the nationality and ethnicity of Chinese at the same time. And it's another tension emerged. It both emphasized on the internationalism as a higher identity in using Benedict Anderson's word in a homogeneous time and space, but also it constantly shaping the Chinese identity, heterogeneous, genius, and exceptional national identity. We can see that in the post-socialist era, especially after the open and reform policy, the latter one, the Chinese, the discourses of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation became the mainstream, and it is also became a developmentalist discourses. Therefore, the whole view of the third world and became have been excelled to some extent and vanished in the horizon as a backward path of Chinese history's perspective. So I just take one of the example of cases to just briefly discuss some cultural practice there in that period. It might be a little bit overwhelmingly politicalized, but I think that their intensive emergence became the very major content of that cultural life. It's in fact shaped the worldview of the whole one or two generations and became the very very important factor of the feeling of structures of feeling. Sorry about that. I think that is also the point of the looking back to that history and the reopening that history. Just for us today to think of something different, something the way we connect with ourselves and the other people and with the others, and to remap the bigger picture world system behind this everything. But I think more importantly that facing the tyranny and the chaos happened outside of this room, as the society and the world was being tearing apart by the right and wrong, the right and left, the radical and conservative, whatever you name it. The third world perspective or view, it reminds us how those people resist once resist those structural oppositions, which still remains today. But also the third world also reminds us to point out a position, I mean, as a rupture of the bipolar system, as a little bit idealistic, though, but I think that position is what we are all looking for today as a student, as a citizen, and maybe as an intellectual. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Liangyu. We appreciate your presentation, especially given the timely nature of how some of these third world politics are also playing out today, as you mentioned in your conclusion. Our third speaker is going to be Huijun Mai, Dr. Huijun Mai, as of 2 weeks ago or so. Huijun Mai just completed her PhD in East Asian Languages and Civilizations at Harvard University. And we are very happy to welcome her to UCLA, where she will be beginning her appointment in the Department of Asian Languages and Cultures very, very soon. She is a specialist in Chinese literature of the Middle Period, basically 220 to 1600, with a training in material culture and intellectual history. Her research adopts an interdisciplinary approach to literary studies, and her current research concerns the rise of material culture and literary discourse during the 11th to 13th century, and how that redefines the boundaries of literature. Her presentation today is entitled Tasting Poetry. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mai.
Thank you. So I'm trying to share my screen right now. Can you see?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me pull it up. Okay, so thank you everyone. I saw lots of familiar faces. Thank you all for coming to this event today. I know it's, as Michael mentioned earlier, it's a very special time, and I hope this at least presents some kind of escape from what is happening right now. So when Michael earlier invited me to be on this panel, he said that one of the important points of this form of meeting is actually to connect disparate fields of research. So in the spirit of cross-disciplinary conversation, I'll share some of the fun texts with you tonight and try to experiment with some ideas and questions that I've been thinking about with regards to these texts. And I'd love to hear what you think about them at the end of our presentation. So the story I'm going to share with you today is actually also about people making connections between disparate spheres. And specifically, I'll be talking about a group of scholars, poets, and philosophers active during the 11th to 13th century China, that's Song Dynasty. I'm looking at how they make connections between the poetic sphere, poetry, and the gustatory, which means the food, and about reading as an intellectual activity and also savoring food as a form of corporal pleasure. So in some, we'll be talking about the songwriters and readers and how they engage the gustatory sense of taste to bring about a new way of thinking about poetry, and also in general about reading and thinking about text. So how does one read and understand poetry? This is a universal issue concerning the poetic art. And in fact, I recently came across a very old Italian film called The Postman, which tells a very moving story about the power of poetry to revolutionize and define the way one exists in the world. So in this movie, there was a scene that I thought is extremely interesting. It's a scene about the protagonist called Mario, this person. So he is the postman, the son of a local fisherman on an Italian island off coast to Naples, who was influenced by Neruda, Pablo Neruda, who was at the time in exile in Italy. So here we have the scene in which Mario is trying to ask Pablo Neruda what is poetry and why he couldn't make sense of some of his lines. So I thought this actually brings out the issue of poetic thinking and understanding that is at the center of our discussion today. So let's first enjoy a very short video clip from the movie.
Quando hai detto sono stanca di essere uomo, perché è una cosa che pure a me, no? mi succede, però non lo sapevo dire. E quando l'ho letto mi è piaciuto. Ma è perché l'odore dei parrucchieri mi fa piangere? Ma vedi Mario,
Io non so dire quello che hai letto con parole diverse da quelle che ho usato. Quando la spieghi la poesia diventa banale. Meglio di ogni spiegazione è l'esperienza diretta delle emozioni che può svelare la poesia a un animo disposto a comprendere.
Okay, so here we see Mario asking Neruda to explain one of his poetic lines into everyday language, to which Neruda, smiling in enigma, refused and suggested instead that Mario directly experience the emotions that was revealed in his poetry. So the central issue here is, how does one talk about poetry when the meaning of poetry is not reducible to paraphrasing of bullet points of meaning? So I said earlier that this is a universal problem. And we have actually seen versions of both attempts at explaining poetry and attempts at directly experiencing poetry from other approaches in very prominent actually in Chinese literary discourse. Take, for example, the most commentated poet Du Fu, whose poetry has been compared to Shakespeare and Wordsworth and also other important poets in the West. So beginning with the printing of Du Fu's corpus in the mid-11th century Song China, it has actually inspired a huge body of explanations, of commentaries in the forms of annotations, and such as this one you saw on the screen, collective commentaries of 1,000 critics on Du Fu's poetry. So from the title is actually very telling, albeit a little bit exaggerated, expression of how the Song and subsequent dynasties' critics try and attempted to understand Du Fu by taking the lines and words from his poetry and analyze it, paraphrase it in their own language. So this approach actually remains dominant well throughout Imperial China and also lasts into today's scholarship. But what I want to introduce to you today is rather a different way of thinking about poetry that is equally emerging in the Song literary discourse, but our scholarship haven't really looked into that tradition. And my way of seeing it is, as you saw in my title, tasting poetry, which so to give you a taste of what I mean by tasting poetry, I'd like to share with you a text from a 12th century cookbook called The Pure Offerings from a Mountain Home, Shanjia Qinggong. And so there are scholars of Chinese history and culinary history specifically, and also medical history, who actually looked at this cookbook in terms of say, medical history. And actually a friend of mine, a graduate from UCLA, Mei Zhang, we have recently discussed this text together, and she's looking at the text from the viewpoint of the construction of the aesthetic ideal of pure, the qing. So for me, this is a text of literary criticism in the form of a cookbook. And to show you what I mean by that, I'll invite you to look at a specific recipe here, where Ling Hong makes a noodle dish called the sulfur leaves noodle, Huaiye Tao, based on one of Du Fu's poem. And so the beginning of the recipe, in the beginning, Ling Hong tells his reader that he actually derives the recipe from Du Fu's poetry, which begins with, sorry. Okay, there's a mix-up in the PowerPoint. Okay, so it begins with a recitation of a few of Du Fu's poem's lines, beginning with green are the high sulfur tree leaves. We pluck them and send them to the kitchen. Fresh noodles come from the market nearby. They're combined with the juice and crushed leaves. They're then put in the kettle to ensure that they'll be quickly done. I eat more, worrying that it would soon be gone. So as you see here, by beginning with Du Fu's poetry, Lin Hong's anchoring his recipe in Du Fu's corpus. And sure enough, this recipe is followed up by Lin Hong trying to paraphrase Du Fu's poetic line and recapturing the steps and procedures in which Du Fu makes this dish. And he goes, this shows Du Fu's method of making the noodles. In summertime, pick fine sulfur tree leaves that are high up, blanch the leaves in boiling water, then chop them finely and sift the water till clear. Mix it with flour to make the noodle and use vinegar to make hot sauce. Decorate the dish with finely chopped green leaves and serve it on a plate. This is to preserve the lovely emerald color. So as you can see, Du Fu's poem goes on to relate the delicious experience of eating the noodles, which is followed by his thought of galloping on the best horses here. So this is Du Fu's original poem, Cold Noodle Soup with Sulfur Tree Leaves. And following the earlier section that Lin Hong cited, here Du Fu goes on to talk about the experience of tasting the dish, and which is followed by a second half, a significant half of the poem, which talks about Du Fu's wish, his desire to ride on the best horse and to offer his dish to the emperor. So in Lin Hong's recipe, the process of making the cold noodle dish takes place alongside the reading of the poem, as Lin Hong replaces the part of Du Fu's poem where he consumes the noodles with the reader's own experience of cooking and eating. And Lin Hong concludes the recipe by reading the last line of Du Fu's poem. The last couplet says, late in the day, when the ruler is enjoying the cool, the flavor too is needed for the occasion. This flavor meaning the noodle that he just made. This shows that not only the poet never forgets his emperor even for a meal's time, but also someone as prestigious as the emperor would enjoy such flavor of the mountain and the forest. How delicious poetry. So here what Lin Hong presents is a way of tasting poetry, of course, alongside the tasting of the dish that this poem is talking about. So when savoring the dish, the process of savoring the dish is actually one and the same with the process of reading the poem. And in the end, the eater actually tastes the sweetness, the deliciousness of the poetry. So Lin's reading is actually a combination of a prominent Song understanding of Du Fu's figure as a loyal subject of the empire. And almost comically here you see that Lin Hong is actually subscribing to Du Fu's wishful thinking in his poem, that he said, now we see that someone as prestigious as the emperor would be in need of our humble noodle dish. So, however, I think this is perfectly fitting because through the culinary replication of Du Fu's poetry and the consumption of that culinary replication, the reader is now placed perfectly in the poet's shoes. By that I mean now you see the reader thinking as Du Fu thinks, and he believes what Du Fu believes. So Lin Hong's strange gustatory poetics did not come out of nowhere. Actually, a century earlier in the 11th century, Su Shi, a literary luminary of the 11th century, actually discussed his experience of reading Huang Tingjian, his friend's poetry, in a gustatory way. And he said, Wang Luzhi's poetry tastes like crabs and scallops. They're so matchless in flavor that they render all foods tasteless. But one must not eat too much of it, unless one get a stroke. The translation is actually a bit off. Probably not to get a stroke, but just meaning a kind of discomfort, and one's qi would be disturbed. And elsewhere, he also compared the prose works written by a certain scholar Wu Xiucai, to the exquisite meat stew cooked in the finest cauldron. And he said, Reading the precious work you, Scholar Wu, left me is as gratifying as eating fine foods from the 9 quadrants. I have just chewed over 1 slice of meat, tossing it around in a mouth and not willing to swallow it. So instead of taking a poem or an essay and analyze it line by line, Su Shi here is relating his experience as a reader by evoking the multitude of flavors of tasting different foods and matching the taste of different foods to the styles of different poets. And in Su Shi's teacher, Ouyang Xiu actually in his famous remarks on poetry, the 六一诗话, cites one of his own poem, 水谷夜行记子美胜鱼, to illustrate the different styles and characters of Mei Yao Chen's and Su Shunqing's poetry. Both are early 11th century poets. So in this poem, Ouyang Xiu compares the subtle plainness of Mei Yao Chen's poetry to the experience of tasting olives. And this kind of olives is actually not the European olives that we're familiar with. It's actually a kind of a different species of olives produced in southern China. So in the poem, Ouyang Xiu wrote, his, meaning Mei Yao Chen's recent poems are especially ancient and blunt. One chews on them and they're hard to swallow. It is like eating olives. The true flavor gets stronger with time. So Mei's poetry is an acquired taste that demands time and patience. The flavor of his poetry is also not a very impressionistic, strongly made a strong impression when you first read it, but it unfolds in time. Just like chewing olives, one enters the poem through initial stage of astringency and bitterness. It is the kind of poetry that demands the reader's rumination, 咀嚼, and eventually the reader would be rewarded with the true flavor that grows more prominent in time. So how should one 咀嚼, ruminate, or as translated here, chewing on poetry? As Xu Si actually illustrates in his other writing, rumination is about savoring the rich flavors of as many texts as one can get his hands on. So the text that I show on the screen here is from Su Shi's essay, an account, a memorial of the book collection at Mr. Li's mountain studio, 李氏山房藏书记. So the background, the context of this essay is that Su Shi's friend called Li Gongze had a 进士, he had a 进士 degree, and like his fellow townsman Li Gongling, who is a famous painter and calligrapher in northern Song, he was also a very famous, accomplished essayist and painter. But before Li Gongze became successful when he was young, he studied in a Buddhist monastery under Mount Lushan. And after he left to go off for the exam, he donated his book collection and to the Buddhist monastery. And so the people in that monastery missed him, and they actually built his studio into a library, a public library, and invited Su Shi to write a commemorative piece for his library. So Su Shi began by talking about the scarcity of books in the past and the difficulty of accessing knowledge at the time. And he told of an anecdote of an old scholar who remembered that when he was young, he wanted a copy of Shi Ji and Han Shu so much, but he didn't have the economic means to get the books. So when someone eventually lent him the books, he then copied the text by hand and read it out loud day and night. So Su Shi retold the story of this old scholar and actually complained that in recent times, people made imprints of text from books of various masters. Within a day, 10,000 copies could be printed. Scholars now have so many books, and it's so easy to acquire books. So you would think that their literary skills and scholarship should be much better than people in the past, right? But in fact, young students aiming for examination or put their books on the shelf without reading them. Instead, they just roam about talking about things with no foundation. And in contrast to these students that Su Shi criticized, Su Shi actually raised Li Gongzi as the model of scholar who actually read and chewed over and ruminated over all of his books in the library. And so he described Li Gongzi's library collection hosts more than 9,000 yuan of books. And Li Gongzi has already waded the river, explored its origin, picked its flowers and fruits, and chewed over its rich flavor. 咀嚼其高味. He truly owned these books. He embodied this book. His ownership manifested in words and deeds, and his name was known in the world today. So Li Gongzi has fully digested his books and actually embodied them, 以为己有. And he left the books generously for others to ruminate on. He shared his book with the public. So Su Shi ended his piece wishing that he could use what's left of his time to read all of Li Gongzi's leftover that he so generously shared. For Su Shi, reading or ruminating, 咀嚼, is an activity just like eating to taste the rich flavor, the 高味 of the books and knowledge. So the 11th century notion of tasting poetry shows a very deep engagement, as we saw earlier, with the sensory and with the material experiences of the body. And as we read in Su Shi's and Ling Hong's piece, the key is to read as miscellaneous as possible, just like plunging into the gustatory adventures. For him, there's no such thing as the authoritative or the normative taste. 天下无正味. If Su Shi's rumination means multitude, because flavor is the one thing that cannot really be reduced to a single entity, right? And we all have the experience of eating something. The more you chew, the more endlessly different flavor comes out in the act of chewing and ruminating. So if Su Shi's rumination means multiplicity and the sensuous pleasure and gratification from the multiplicity and the richness of flavor, then rumination came to mean very different things later in the 12th century. We have seen earlier in the opening of my presentation one version of the 12th century development of this notion of flavor, poetic flavor. Now we're turning to Zhu Xi, who present to us a very different flavor. In his writing, in his written communications with various scholars, Su Shi openly criticized, Zhu Xi openly criticized Su Shi and his brother Su Zhe's discourse about the classics and about the text as being too quick to judge, 议论失之太快, and that the Su's discourse is not worth chewing. 二苏议论皆失之太快, 不耐咀嚼. So in his letter to one of his students named Xu Shenzhi, Zhu Xi also criticized his writing exactly for the same reason, for the lack of an aftertaste, the yu wei. In other words, that his writing does not lend itself to rumination. And as Zhu Xi said, what you wrote in your letter are all appropriate, 皆地当之论, but I just don't like the lack of aftertaste. So to remedy this, Zhu Xi instructs Xu Shenzhi, his student, that he should read carefully further into the plain and concrete places, and he must then get the flavor, first get the flavor from the flavorlessness, and then he will know the taste of aftertaste. So what is happening here? What Zhu Xi proposed here, I think, is a method of reduction, quite different from the idea of flavor as multiplicity and multitude, as endlessly extractable thing, as we saw earlier. And similarly, in a letter to Wang Jingfu, his other student, Zhu Xi advised his Wang Jingfu to just chew over the text of the classics thoroughly, 就本经文义上烂熟咀嚼之为玉, and he'll get the meaning of the sages. So what Zhu Xi meant here was simple and rather revolutionary at his time. He meant that you should only focus on the original text, the foundational classics, the 45经 in particular, and you should get rid of other books which will distract you. So what Zhu Xi proposed here is a method of reduction. Perhaps it has to do, I think, with the need to navigate the overwhelming information made available by the technology of printing in the 12th century. So we should, of course, bear in mind that the object of Zhu Xi's rumination of his 咀嚼 is rather than literary writings, the subject is actually the way, 道学, the learning of the Tao. And correspondingly, the kind of flavor of text that Zhu Xi had in mind was very different from the rich flavor, the gao wei of meat stewed or seafood, or the flavor of olives, which changes and grows prominent with time. But what he's talking about is the absence of flavor, the flavorlessness in his words, the taste of blandness, that is the flavor of the way. As Lao Tzu put it in the Dao De Jing, 道之出口淡而无味. So Dao tastes bland and the complete lack of flavor. So here we have Zhu Xi's own version of the flavor of Dao, which he puts in a way that says the taste of Dao is, although bland, it's actually rich. The meaning of Dao, although simple, is actually profound. So the problem here is actually the disjunction between the surface and interior of text, right? What we saw on the surface is bland, flavorless, boring. So this boring surface is concealing, Zhu Xi thinks, is concealing the rich interior, but it's also the entrance. It's the necessary entrance to the very rich interior of Tao. So to ruminate for Su Shi, then one is to go beyond the sensuous pleasure, the sensuous surface of taste, and to calibrate one's sensitivity and intellectual discernment in order to taste the most exquisite flavor of the Tao. Instead, it's about chewing over texts of a handful of Confucian classics. It's not about reading as widely and broadly as possible, as we saw in Su Shi. And these texts, they share one thing in common. They seem at first tasteless and boring, but the more you ruminate, Zhu Xi promises that you'll be able to taste the true flavor of everything from exactly the lack of flavor at the first glance. So Zhu Xi's version of savoring books, one can say, is about going beyond the sensual surfaces of flavor and to train one's mind to discern the subtle and forever endlessly mutating or endlessly richer flavor of the way that is being concealed behind the surface. So that's one way of looking at it. But we also notice how Zhu Xi and other Daoxue scholars took the idea of flavor, a true body word. By that I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of flavor is precisely the attention to the particulars of flavor, right? The more you chew on, the more multiplicity of flavors that you get. So it's not reducible to one single idea or one single Dao per se. So I have begun recently to think about whether Zhu Xi's twisting or Zhu Xi's way of thinking about tasting poetry and tasting text is actually turning it into something ethereal with no flavor at all. So with the birth of Daoxue's rumination, are we losing the the flavor of poetry and of reading and of books. With this question, I end my presentation today, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mai. We appreciate your presentation. As all three of the presentations, really wonderful, very different, very disparate. And that, again, for those who are joining us late, the point of this forum is to bring together very different perspectives, and hopefully those people who came to hear Dr. Mai, who are Song Dynasty specialists, get stuck with two presentations completely outside their comfort zone. Those from the Anderson School that came to hear Dr. Wu get stuck likewise with two humanities papers. But the point is, we really want to bring scholars together working on different areas of Chinese studies and kind of foster this kind of dialogue. And with that, the floor is now open for dialogue. And so if you know how to use the raise your hand function, you can press that, and then we will ask you to try to give a fairly succinct question, and then we'll allow our speakers to address your questions. I've been doing the previous events asynchronous, just me one-on-one with speakers, and so I'm going to try not to hog any time and really let our constituents ask their questions. So please, if you have questions.
If you don't see the raise your hand function, feel free to type in the chat as well. So we'll see it in chat.
While we're waiting for audience questions, I'm wondering if among our panelists, if you have questions for each other that you want to get the ball rolling with.
Yeah, can I ask a question to Huijun?
Welcome.
Work. I mean, it's definitely opened my eyes, and I've never really heard much like talk on Song poetry. So I'm wondering, so in the poet's depiction on different food and different food flavors, is that, I mean, is there a particular category food they tend to lean on? Like you're talking about the gao wei is like rich flavor, and also the cold noodle seems very delicate. So I'm interested in, I mean, the basically the hierarchy of food. So do they also referring sometimes to the food that are not typically delicious or not typically consumed by people higher, I mean, status, like the everyday food that farmers eat, like things like that?
Yeah. Wonderful question. Thank you, Sherry. So there are periodization to the answer of your question. So I think in the early 11th century, one historical fact that was happening is that with the flooding of scholars from the peripheral, especially from the south, into the northern capital of Kaifeng at the time, we see opening up of southern cuisine restaurants. So that's how you saw the fascination with seafood, which was not which was still quite exotic at the time to northerners. So we do see a fascination with things like scallops, crabs, and for one thing, Taizong, I think Emperor Taizong, which is the protagonist of one very hot TV drama broadcasting right now, he is particularly portrayed as a lover of crabs. So seafood, and also I mentioned in one of the anecdotes, the taste of olives, ganlan, very Guangdong, I think a Guangdong fruit, also capture the imagination of the poets because the strange changing flavor. So they like to talk about how the taste is at first bitter and then it turns to sweet, and then they allegorize it or make it a metaphor to talk about many other things, including politics and also poetry. As for everyday food, I actually, one of the tenets of my research right now is to look at how the everyday figure into high literary genres such as poetry and prose, and how the experience of the everyday actually redefine the canon as we know of as we know it, as we know the song canon, how thinking about everyday experiences and also the writing of those experiences actually give us a new picture of what poetry was about, and also what literature is constituted in this in the song.
Thank you, Huijun.
Yeah, I don't know whether that answers all of the questions, but can I ask one question to Sherry? I was actually making some notes when you were talking. I actually took some courses in economics and management back in my college years. So the method that you were engaging in sort of investigating and conducting experiment with the workers all brings back a sort of nostalgia to me. So I was wondering, because you were looking specifically at one type of group participation, right? Mainly the morning exercise that they conducted every day. I wonder if it would be of your concern to also include other types of, say, more private and not, I mean, because your main focus is in the factory setting. It's quite public and also official, right? You're utilizing their established infrastructure. But would it be productive, I imagine, to also include their everyday private social interactions, and whether there are, for example, poetry reciting group or book club that is shared among the workers, and whether that figure into your investigation at all?
Yeah, I think so. That's a great question. So I think I define in this line of work a participation in a specific way, in the participation within your own group. So I was like trying to test what the power of group dynamics, like this participatory dynamics, can change behavior. So that's why I started out in workplaces, and to test whether participation in local workplaces can actually spill over to your private life, or how people's tendency to make decisions in within their household. So we ask those questions, but it will be interesting to see whether the reverse also happens. So if we induce more participation in these people's private life, if we basically have it, for example, I would like brainstorming a training session, if we train women, for example, to make better decisions or participate in more decisions in their household, will that bring back to how they behave in the workplaces? And that's, I think, possible that the spillover can go either way. And some of my future study, I was actually trying to study outside of the work group. So how about civic participation in a group? So I think this poetry reciting group will be an interesting one. And also how about civic social groups participating on discussing on their local events. I think different forms of participation might have different manifestations and also have different effects on people's psychology, depending on what domain of outcomes we are studying at. So it's definitely a direction I hope to go more deeply.
Yeah, because one of the really heated topic of discussion in at least Chinese literature is how the factory worker, some of the really famous factory worker peasant poets were participating in contemporary Chinese poetic scene. And they were actually changing, I think, the way people think about contemporary Chinese poetry and how and its place in people's life very much.
I believe there's even a film and a documentary and an anthology, I think it's called Iron Moon, of poetry by Chinese migrant workers. Yeah. So there is an audience question for Huijun, but I want to try to, and before we go to the audience question, I want to keep the panel kind of democratic. So maybe I will ask a quick question for Liangyu first. And that is, you began your talk with this overview of some contemporary Chinese films like Wolf Warrior 2, Operation Red Sea, which are kind of revisiting this third world politic after a long absence, right? You said after the 80s, it kind of disappeared for a long time. But I'm wondering, this recent resurgence of interest in the third world in this series of contemporary films, to what extent are they really revisiting the themes from the Maoist era, the period you're looking at, right, the 50s through the 70s? Are there elements that you're seeing picked up and kind of reinvigorated, or is it a completely new discourse in terms of how they're framing the third world in these more contemporary films? Do you see it a kind of a continuity, or is it a major break?
It's from my point of view, it's definitely there is definitely a big rupture, a big gap between how we depict nowadays and back to the socialist era. That's also the question why I like to look at the past rather than the current those films and cinemas. I think if you look at those Wolf Warriors and Red Sea Operation or something like that, it's more like a developmentalist discourse behind them. You treat it like unmastered land. Those areas, unmastered land, are chaotic and full of violence, and need to be protected and saved, and also full of the resources. You see, there was Chinese enterprises over there, businessmen need to be saved and protected from the crisis. It's more or less. I think there's another great example that it's 2 or 3 years ago in Chinese Spring Festival Gala, CCTV Chunwan, and there is also a play show called how to translate it, 同喜同乐, or something that's it's quite controversial. That Chinese comedian just blacked her face and acted like African people, and just saying that I would like to learn Chinese style life or something like that, learn Chinese languages and become Chinese, something like that. It's quite disturbing actually for me. But when you look at the socialist era's cultural practices, you can also see that blackface is also practiced in another terms. That in some dancing performing groups that they introduce the African dance and introduce them to perform to Chinese audiences, and they dress like the African people and the black their faces, but it's totally in mass culture and facing a large number of the honored people and using proletarian class discourses rather than the third world is underdeveloped, China is now first world, those type of discourses. So for me, it's rather different, and also this is the reason why I like to look at how was it once depicted and portrayed, and what kind of logic is behind that.
Thank you, Liangyu. Then why don't we turn to Professor Zhang Meimei, who is an alumni of UCLA and currently a professor at Occidental College. I believe she has a question for Huijun.
Thank you, Professor Barry. Yes, I do have a question, maybe not one question, but 2 questions for Huijun. So it's definitely fascinating to hear your talk about Song Dynasty poetry again. And I have questions. So firstly, I realized that the title of today's talk is Tasting Poetry instead of tasting literature. So I wonder if I think you mentioned a little bit in your talk, but I wonder if there is a shift of the object of the rumination or tasting the lyric text from Northern Song to Southern Song. Is it, correct me if I'm wrong, is it in the beginning, especially in the Northern Song dynasty, the main object of this kind of evaluation is poetic text, but in the Southern Song dynasty, in Zhuxi's time, is more philosophical arguments, yes, and moral text. So this is the first question. And my second question is about the overlapping between gastronomical terms and evaluative phrase and with literary evaluative terms. But I think, is it sometimes they're not like 100% overlapping, especially the example that you gave in the beginning. I don't remember. I think maybe it's Ou Yangshu's poem. So I realized that he used the word 苦 as a positive
Right.
to evaluate the poem, while 苦 will not as bitter flavor is not a positive term to when we describe flavor. And I don't know what's your take to the differences and distinctions between yes, those terms in the two different parties.
Right, thanks Mei Mei. Great to see you. So let me answer your first question. I should say I'm not arguing that there's a shift of gustatory object in terms of a shift from poetry to Dao that's happening from Northern Song to Southern Song. What I wanted the presentation to emphasize is that it's a shift of emphasis on what flavor is and what tasting means. So to give you a very quick example of, I think the discourse of tasting Dao actually, contrary to some of our imagination, it actually is already very strong in Northern Song. So particularly when people were discussing this particular line from Zhongyong, where Zisi was saying, I think he says, 道之不行以我之之, 或者那个, so it's a line from Zhongyong which which is there for like so long, but it's picking up in the Northern Song because people are giving, especially the Ercheng and all the other scholars on the classics, were giving more emphasis on the text of Zhongyong in the Northern Song. So people began to talk about what does it mean to 知味, to know flavor, because it was Zisi allegedly who juxtaposed the knowing of flavor to the practicing of Dao. So then the reason why, I think one of the reasons why the discourse on flavor became so prominent in the song is precisely because of this kind of philosophical and moral discourse that began in the Northern Song. And I think that what's happening in the moral discourse is quite different from when we think about poetry, right? Because if all the poetic styles could be reduced to a single poetic style, then it would be quite boring. But what you saw in Ou Yangshu's, you also saw in Ou Yangshu's evaluation of Mei Yao Chen, which became almost the classic evaluation of Mei Yao Chen, which is the Pingdan master, the poet who mastered his poetic language so well that a very like on the surface a very simple text is actually Wei Yu, so has rich layers of flavors the more you read it. So it is that model of poetry, according to Mei Yao Chen, is actually quite different from what the normative poetic styles were in the Northern Song, and that is the reason why he actually singled it out to talk about it in his 六一诗话. I think over 2 or 3 passages in that 诗话. So the question about bitterness, so it might be contrary to our moderners' imagination, the taste of bitterness is actually not necessarily something negative, because it's one of the 5 modalities of taste, the Wu Wei, that comes with traditional Chinese cosmology, which corresponds to the Wu Xing, right? So, but what fascinates poets here, as I mentioned earlier, is the ability of a flavor and of a poetry to change during the course of the poem. So imagine reading a poem and thinking that when you read the first line, you thought it was one thing. You thought it was delivering one message. And then when it comes to the end, it turns out to be a completely different poem. So I think that's one version of this 味咏 or a 回味, the returning flavor, or the flavor that comes out to be very different when you think about it after reading it. So does that answer both of your questions?
Yes, I think so. Yes, especially I think for the second, I like your comment, and I think it can also apply not only like in literary sphere, but also in text about music during this time.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, they emphasize on the lingering like sound.
Right.
Flavor.
Yeah, the Huijun, right? True, and it's of course it's a notion from Li Ji and Zheng Yong. The emphasis on simplicity and on the fact that the notion of something lingering and residual, like how the form of poetry and the form of music, what you could hear and what you could see, cannot exhaust what poetry is all about. So there's something left over beyond the form, the constructed form of poetry.
Yeah, and also a very, very short comment. So I wonder if there's any like text mention tasting poetic text that specific poetic text belongs to the genre of 词 lyric.
Yeah, I think so. In 词话, and also, in fact, even within the 词 lyrics itself, the notion of 滋味, of flavor, is quite different from that in the poetry. So in the 词, as far as what I saw, it's more about recalling the memories, the nostalgia, memory of the past when romance happened, something like that. It's a very richly, it's a very rich echo. Like you look back to the past and you think of its 滋味. So yeah, I'm yet to look into the sphere of lyrics. It's an entirely different discourse, of course. But I believe, and I saw examples that it was there. It just takes on quite different form and flavor.
Thank you, Huijun.
So I don't see any other questions queued up. So I'm going to jump in with a practical question for everyone. And one commonality we have among our presenters is that you're all either, well, Liangyu is writing his dissertation right now. Huijun just finished literally a couple weeks ago, and Professor Wu, I guess you're not too far away, at least a year or two, right? It's not a distant memory yet. And so I'm wondering if each of you could share a little bit about your research methods and what kind of archival work or field work you did. Like Professor Wu, I'm imagining you must have actually spent time in these factories. Liangyu, I'm curious what kind of archival work you're doing. And then because we have so many grad students in the participant room, maybe you could also share some advice for them, for those students who are writing their dissertations now, given you've all kind of just coming out of it or finishing this stage. Based on your own experience doing field work, doing archival work, visiting factories, what do you have to share with our grad students that you think might help them along the way?
Yeah, I can speak first. So I think, so one of the things I learned from this experience is you have to be persistent. So I just graduated from Princeton last year, so brand new. And this project I actually started at the end of my first year PhD in 2014, 2013-14. So I actually did not expect it to be my dissertation. I just spent a month there doing observation work. I shadowed a factory woman who were close to my age, and we take the buses together and chatted and eat the same cafeteria meal. So at that time, I really want to dig into their psychology. What are they thinking? What's their aspiration? What's their ambition? And what can we do there? So I think especially in field work, I do not set a set of agenda. I want to explore along the way and let the hypothesis that this generate by itself when I was in the field. But it turns out to be, so after, I think we really need to understand what are the people we are studying and what's the context that could be relevant to our research. A good hypothesis will come itself after you learn enough about the people and the context. And when talking about persistent, I was like, so one anecdote I had was like, this project almost did not happen. So I planned it out. I wanted to run this intervention, but the factory management actually did not have a strong pushback against us. They think we might, they're very risk averse as factory management, understandably. So they're concerned of like workers' strike or a lot of the rumor going on about factory management. So we as field researchers have to think about not only how to be a good scholar, but also how to do good project management on the side by talking to the managers and negotiating what could be good for them and how to solve the risk factors they're concerned about. So engaging in these conversations take quite some time. So be persistent, even if failed in the first time or second time, and just like keep pushing. And this is, I think, one of the very important lessons I learned as a graduate student, and also one piece of advice I want to give to the current graduate student. So nothing comes smoothly. So we really have to push very hard if it's something that you're really passionate about.
Could I ask a follow-up? What was the single greatest challenge you faced during your field work, and how did you surpass that challenge?
Yeah, so the single greatest challenge is like we have everything ready. So we have like, I hired a team of research assistants who are ready to go into the factory, who are well trained, because the factory management already told us, yes, you can do this intervention in spring. And I flew back to China from Princeton, like stay there for the whole semester and waiting to do this project. But then they back up on the site, say, no, we are not ready. But we have already put all the resources, and I'm taking a gap semester just to be in the field. So I was super depressed, what can I do? And at that time, it was really hard. But we work around and maybe like, well, let's telling the factory, maybe we can do a small team first to do the pilot work to ensure there's no backlash. And we did that for 1 month, and the factory got reassured. And then like nudging step by step into making them do this full intervention, as they already said yes half a year ago. So that was the most challenging. There's a lot of unexpected events coming up. And I think one thing about fieldwork is I have to be ready about the unexpectancy going on. So nothing would go as planned. So this is one of the expectations I constantly have as a field researcher.
Thank you. Liangyu, do you want to share some of your experience?
Yeah, considering I'm still at the very beginning phase of my dissertation, but I can share some experiences maybe. I totally agree with what Sherry said. The persistency it is crucial. That I tried to take a experiment in the past month that I found out the best way to works for me. That I am a morning person, so I wake up every morning and I wrote 1,000 to 2,000 Chinese characters every day. So whatever it is, how bad it looks like, but I just put it on a Word document and just edit them one by one, piece by piece. But it's compulsory that you have to write something down on the paper first. Like there was also the finished paper is the best paper. So the finished work, daily work is the best work you can do. And so try not to get interrupted. And I think it's a perfect timing for someone to working on dissertation or thesis. You can't go anywhere anyway. And also if people are interested in socialist eras like 50s to 70s, it is important to look at those old newspapers like the Min Daily and the theater, the Wen Yi Bao, etc. I think there were lots of database online, and even the People's Daily have their own free access to the old newspaper. You can just you just like reading newspaper every day and to do piece by piece, and they're related to the big history events, which also heavily affected on the cultural production practices. So be familiar with which historical period you're looking at is also crucial. So this is the two experiences I can conclude by now, maybe.
Thank you. Huijun?
Sure. I want to first preface my, shall we say, advice, anything, by saying that I totally agree with what Liangyu and Sherry had shared. My own experience of writing the dissertation is also an uphill battle. You would face the most severe criticism, not from your advisor and not from your friends, but from yourself. So when you write, you might want to stop or delete everything that you just typed, but please keep on typing, because once you have something there to work with, it's a very different story. So and my own, I guess I can share some of my own experience about doing archival research in Japan. And I've also been on archival trip to Chinese National Library, but it was not extremely fruitful. But my archival, so I stayed in Japan a couple of times. The longest duration I stayed is half a year, which was, I think, last year. I was on Japan Foundation scholarship. And also, if you do have materials in Japan that you really want to look at, I also highly recommend applying for Japan Foundation. They're very generous in their scholarship, and they're also very flexible in terms of how you want to go about doing your research while you were there. So that said, I think when I was there, I was looking specifically for materials related to my second project, which is about the 5 mountain periods poetic exchange and material exchange between Zhejiang area in China and the monasteries in Japan. So, but I unexpectedly encounter a lot of materials preserved in Japan that has to do with my current dissertation. So you'll be amazed at what you will be able to find. So what's like one set of materials that I found when I was there is actually, I think 17th to 18th century Edo period Japanese scholars, scholars who focus on Chinese texts specifically. They were actually copying these Song texts and Song texts about things and about plants, animals, and local products, which was which got into Japan through a Ming edition. So they were copying these texts, and these texts actually inspired the Japanese scholars to start investigating their own native plants and animals. And I think that has to do with the first wave of Edo period scholars writing about Japanese natural history. So, so that process actually led to a discovery of a very exciting field of research and also communication with scholars in that field. So I would also say, yeah, archival research could be very fruitful if you know where you're looking at. And feel free to email or be in contact with scholars or researchers that you had in mind who had to do, who written on the field that you are working on right now. Don't be afraid to send emails.
Thank you, Huijun. And we're running short on time, but we have time for one final question from Cien. I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, I have a question for Sherry. And I think that your finding on the last part of your finding is extremely interesting, and in the sense that actually by participating, people actually change their perceptions towards the general authority and also their belief in a just world. And I was just wondering what could be the psychology behind this. Can it be explained by the agency theory, or is there some other explanation for this? Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, great question. So I was about to type it in the chat box and I saw your question. So actually, we do find that workers reported more sense of control after week 1, after the end of the intervention, so which is consistent with your agency hypothesis. So workers do feel more agentic after these participatory meetings. But surprisingly, actually did not correlate with the results on authority and justice attitudes, so which is puzzling at first because we also thought it might be correlated with agency. So I think what might be the psychological mechanism going on here is, like, first of all, that might be a contrasting experience. So they are now experiencing more after rehearsing this, having more authority in these group meetings, 20 minutes once per week. So they actually have this like repeated immersive experience, which they might be used to contrast what they are experiencing in the larger society. So now, like, you can think about it, I'm having this experience at work, but I'm not having experience in the larger society, given that most of them are young women who are on a lower totem pole of the society. So, which can be a possibility. And another one is consistent with the theory of participatory democracy. So actually, by cultivating by rehearsing your authority and cultivating more skepticism on how you are doing your work, and also having your voice expressing within a group context. So it could be cultivating a more intrinsic tendency to acting out in general. So that's our two hypotheses we are thinking about, and I'm looking forward to test them in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. And with that, we're really running out of time. I do want to say this is our first live Center for Chinese Studies event we've done, and we're still in the infancy of our online digital footprint. And so as we move forward, I also want to reach out to our constituents, that is our undergrads, our grad students, our faculty. If there are suggestions, ideas for future events for us to move forward, please email me. We are really excited to work with all of you to explore this new digital world that we are stuck in due to COVID-19. And so I hope to see you online at other future events. Special thanks to our 3 wonderful speakers today, Huijun Mai, Hu Liangyu, and Sherry Wu. We really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules. Thanks to Esther Rowe, our Assistant Director of the Center for Chinese Studies, for all of the logistics and help. And again, thanks to all of our participants who took time out of your schedules to attend today. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Professor Berry, for your organizing. Thank you.
Have a good day.
Thanks.